Indian Society. Textbook in Sociology for Class 12. Forward. The National Curriculum Framework, NCF, 2005, recommends that children's life at school must be linked to their life outside the school. This principle marks a departure from the legacy of bookish learning which continues to shape our system and causes a gap between the school, home, and community. The syllabi and textbooks developed on the basis of NCF signify an attempt to implement this basic idea. They also attempt to discourage rote learning and the maintenance of sharp boundaries between different subject areas. We hope these measures will take us significantly further in the direction of a child-centered system of education outlined in the National Policy on Education, 1986. The success of this effort depends on the steps that school principals and teachers will take to encourage children to reflect on their own learning and to pursue imaginative activities and questions. We must recognize that, given space, time and freedom, children generate new knowledge by engaging with the information passed on to them by adults. Treating the prescribed textbook as the sole basis of examination is one of the key reasons why other resources and sites of learning are ignored. Inculcating creativity and initiative is possible if we perceive and treat children as participants in learning, not as receivers of a fixed body of knowledge. These aims imply considerable change in school routines and mode of functioning. Flexibility in the daily timetables is as necessary as rigor in implementing the annual calendar so that the required number of teaching days are actually devoted to teaching. The methods used for teaching and evaluation will also determine how effective this textbook proves for making children's life at school a happy experience, rather than a source of stress or problem. Syllabus designers have tried to address the problem of curricular burden by restructuring and reorienting knowledge at different stages with greater consideration for child psychology and the time available for teaching. The textbook attempts to enhance this endeavor by giving higher priority and space to opportunities for contemplation and wondering, discussion in small groups, and activities requiring hands-on experience. The National Council of Educational Research and Training, NCERT, appreciates the hard work done by the Textbook Development Committee. We wish to thank the chairperson of the Advisory Group in Social Sciences, Professor Hari Vasudevan, and the chief advisor for this textbook, Professor Yogendra Singh, for guiding the work of this committee. Several teachers also contributed to the development of this textbook. We are grateful to their principals for making this possible. We are indebted to the institutions and organizations which have generously permitted us to draw upon their resources, material, and personnel. We are especially grateful to the members of the National Monitoring Committee, appointed by the Department of Secondary and Higher Education, Ministry of Human Resource Development under the chairpersonship of Professor Mrinal Miri and Professor G.P. Deshpande, for their valuable time and contribution. As an organization committed to systemic reform and continuous improvement in the quality of its products, NCERT welcomes comments and suggestions which will enable us to undertake further revision and refinement. Director, National Council of Educational Research and Training. November 20, 2006. New Delhi. How to use this textbook. This is the first of the 2 textbooks for Class 12 in Sociology. It is designed to address the spirit of the new guidelines issued by the National Curriculum Framework 2005, as well as the specific objectives of the sociology curriculum adopted by the NCERT, Box 1. Box 1, Objectives of the Sociology Curriculum, NCERT 2005. To enable learners to relate classroom teaching to their outside environment. To introduce them to the basic concepts of sociology that will enable them to observe and interpret social life. To be aware of the complexity of social processes. To appreciate diversity in society in India and the world at large. To build the capacity of students to understand and analyze the changes in contemporary Indian society. Indian Society builds on the 2 textbooks for Class 11, and complements the 2nd textbook for Class 12 Social Change and Development in India. The specific correspondence of chapters and sections to the NCERT syllabus is indicated in Box 2. This is a suggested correspondence, Teachers may also find other sections to be relevant or useful for particular segments of the syllabus. Box 2, Correspondence with the NCERT Sociology syllabus. Chapters and sections of this textbook relating to syllabus topics are indicated in brackets after each syllabus section. Unit 1, Structure of Indian Society. 1.1 Introducing Indian Society, Chapter 1, Colonialism and the Emergence of New Markets in 4.1, Communities, Nations, and Nation-States in 6.1, 1.2 Demographic Structure, Chapter 2. 1.3 Rural-Urban Linkages and Divisions, Chapter 2.6, Section on Weekly Tribal Market in 4.1. Unit 2, Social Institutions, Continuity and Change 2.1 Family and Kinship, Chapter 3.3, Chapter 5.3. 2.2 The Caste System, Chapter 3.1, Caste-Based Markets and Trading Networks in 4.1, Chapter 5.2. 2.3 Tribal Society, Chapter 3.2, Section on Weekly Tribal Market in 4.1. 2.4 The Market as a Social Institution, Chapter 4. Unit 3, Social Inequality and Exclusion. 3.1 Caste Prejudice, Scheduled Castes and Other Backward Classes, Chapter 5.1, 5.2. 3.2 Marginalization of Tribal Communities, Chapter 5.1, 5.2. 3.3 The Struggle for Women's Equality, Chapter 5.3, Chapter 3.3. 3.4 The Protection of Religious Minorities, Chapter 6.1, 6.3. 3.5 Caring for the Differently Abled, Chapter 5.4. Unit 4, The Challenges of Unity in Diversity. 4.1 Problems of Communalism, Regionalism, Casteism, Chapter 6, Chapter 5.1, 5.2. 4.2 Role of the State in a Plural and Unequal Society, Chapter 6, 6.1, Chapter 5.1, 5.2. 4.3 What We Share, Chapter 6, 6.1, 6.4. Unit 5. Project Work, Chapter 7. Suggestions for use. As already mentioned, this textbook is intended to reflect the spirit of the new national curriculum framework, where the emphasis has been on reducing the curricular burden on the child, especially in the form of information to be reproduced. Moreover, an effort has been made to relate the subject matter to the contemporary social environment and to the everyday life of the child. These features necessarily involve changes in the content and format of the textbook, and, of course, in the way that the classroom use of the textbook is to be structured. While each school, each teacher, and each class will doubtless evolve their own ways of using this textbook, it is broadly true that the NCF will shift emphasis towards classroom discussion, activities, and projects, and away from information absorption and reproduction. In addition to these general features of the NCF which will affect all subjects, there are some features specific to the content of this textbook which may require special handling. The obvious candidates are the chapters on caste and other forms of inequality, and those on minorities and related issues, chapters 3, 5, and 6. Depending on the composition of the class, teachers will have to devise their own methods of dealing with sensitive material without making any section of students feel embarrassed. However, at the same time students from dominant sections of the society should also be challenged to question their common sense and to rethink many taken for granted issues and opinions. It is partly in view of these considerations that Chapter 3 is very light on activities, leaving it to the teacher to devise suitable ones for the specific class and the situation in which she/he is teaching. Apart from this exception, however, the text tries to be activity-based. Activities are inserted quite deliberately and are intended to be an integral part of the textbook. Teachers and students are welcome to modify them to suit local situations, but please do not skip them. There are different kind of activities. One kind which is new is called an exercise. It is based on a specific text or table given in the text, and requires students to answer very specific questions. These should be taken as mandatory. Information boxes that are meant to provide contextual material that is not part of the evaluative content, i.e., students will not be examined on this material, are colored, i.e., any color other than shades of gray, which are the standard shades for boxes. In order not to overburden the text, we have not inserted too many references or citations. The references given at the end of each chapter are thus intended to be more of a bibliography rather than simply a list of citations. However, citations are given where specific information or quotations are involved. Teachers are of course welcome to use any additional readings or texts they find useful. There is a consolidated glossary at the end of the textbook, and students should be encouraged to refer to it. Terms explained in detail in the text are generally not included in the glossary. Many, but not all, of the words that are included in the glossary appear in bold when they are first used in the textbook. Remember, every word that appears in bold type will be found in the glossary, but the glossary includes many more words as well. A special word on projects and practical work. This feature is a new one, and involves a significant change in the evaluation procedure. Since at least 20% of the total marks for sociology are to be devoted to this section, close attention should be paid to this. Chapter 7 provides some suggestions, along with a brief recap of the methods discussed in the Class 11 textbook, Chapter 5 of Introducing Sociology. In view of the scheduling of project work, Chapter 7 is perhaps best discussed relatively early in the course, rather than at the end of all the other chapters, preferably after Chapter 2 and 3 have been discussed. The class can revisit Chapter 7 at the end of the textbook, but selection of projects and work on them should start much earlier. The project suggestions are merely indicative, please feel free to devise your own, keeping in mind the constraints and methodological considerations mentioned in Chapter 7. This is NCERT's first attempt to take on board the concerns of the new NCF for Class 12. We are already aware of some ways in which this textbook could be further improved, and we are also confident that during the coming year, teachers and students will come up with many more suggestions and comments that will help us revise it. Please do write to us at the following postal address: the Head, Department of Education in the Social Sciences and Humanities, NCERT, Sri Aurobindo Marg, New Delhi 110016. Or you can send email to ncertsociologytexts@gmail.com. We look forward to your responses, and especially your critical comments, including suggestions for improvements in the layout and format. We promise to acknowledge all useful suggestions in the next edition of this textbook. Acknowledgments. The many debts incurred in meeting the challenge of producing this textbook under a very tight schedule are gratefully acknowledged here. First of all, thanks to all the colleagues who took time off from their other commitments to devote their energies to this task. For contributing substantially to the content of this textbook, thanks to the editorial team members, Amita Bhaviskar, Kushal Deb, Anjan Ghosh, and Carol Upadhyaya. We are also grateful to Professor Nandini Sundar, Department of Sociology, University of Delhi, Ms. Nitya Ramakrishnan, Advocate, New Delhi, Ms. Lata Govindan, Lucknow, Ms. Seema Banerjee, Lakshman Public School, New Delhi, and Mr. Dev Pathak, Bluebell International School, New Delhi for their feedback and inputs. Special thanks are due to Ms. Shweta Rao, who took on the challenge of designing this book and procuring some photographs from different sources in record time. Her contributions are visible on every page. Professor Yogendra Singh, our chief advisor, was, as always, a pillar of support who gave us the necessary confidence to proceed. He and Professor Krishna Kumar, director of the NCERT, provided the abhyastha that enabled and guided our collective efforts. Professor Savita Sinha, head, Department of Education in the Social Sciences and Humanities, lent unstinting support. Dr. Shweta Uppal, chief editor at NCERT, not only facilitated our work but encouraged us to aim higher than we would have dared to otherwise. Special thanks are due to Ms. Vandana R. Singh, consultant editor, NCERT, for going through the manuscript and suggesting relevant changes. The Council gratefully acknowledges the contributions of Ms. Natia Khan, DTP operator, Mr. R.P. Singh and Mr. K. Shairaj Chandrapatra, proofreaders, and Mr. Dinesh Kumar, in charge, computer station in shaping this textbook. We are also grateful to the Publication Department, NCERT, for all their support. Finally, we are grateful to all the institutions and individuals who have kindly allowed us to use material from their publications, each of which is acknowledged in the text. Thanks are due to Dr. C.P. Chandrasekhar, Dr. Ramachandra Guha, and Mr. Basharath Peer for use of material from their articles in Frontline, The Times of India, and T. Helker respectively. The NCERT is specially grateful to Mr. R.K. Lakshman for allowing us to use his cartoons in this textbook, and to Dr. Malvika Karlekar for the use of photographs from her book, Visualizing Indian Women 1875 to 1947, published by Oxford University Press, New Delhi. Some photographs were taken from material published by the Rajasthan Tourism Department, Government of India, New Delhi, India Today, Outlook, and Frontline. The Council thanks the authors, copyright holders, and publishers of these materials. The Council also acknowledges the Press Information Bureau, Ministry of Information and Broadcasting, New Delhi, for allowing the use of photographs available in their photo library. A collage was prepared by a Class 6 student of St. Mary's, New Delhi, Ms. Mahima Chopda, and the NCERT is grateful to her. Some photographs were provided by the Samrakshan Trust, New Delhi, Ms. Arti Nagraj, New Delhi, Mr. Y.K. Gupta and Mr. R.C. Das of the Central Institute of Educational Technology, NCERT, New Delhi. The Council gratefully acknowledges all these contributions.
Contents forward: How to use this textbook. Chapter 1, Introducing Indian Society. Chapter 2, The Demographic Structure of the Indian Society. Chapter 3, The Demographic Structure of the Indian Society. Chapter 4, The Market as a Social Institution. Chapter 5, Patterns of Social Inequality and Exclusion. Chapter 6, The Challenges of Cultural Diversity. Chapter 7, Chapter 1, Introducing Indian Society. In one important sense, sociology is unlike any other subject that you may have studied. It is a subject in which no one starts from zero. Everyone already knows something about society. Other subjects are learnt because they are taught, at school, at home, or elsewhere, but much of our knowledge about society is acquired without explicit teaching. Because it is such an integral part of the process of growing up, knowledge about society seems to be acquired naturally or automatically. No child is expected to already know something about history, geography, psychology, or economics when they come to school. But even a 6-year-old already knows something about society and social relationships. It is all the more true then, that, as young 18-year-old adults, you know a lot about the society you live in without ever having studied it. This prior knowledge or familiarity with society is both an advantage and a disadvantage for sociology, the discipline that studies society. The advantage is that students are generally not afraid of sociology. They feel that it can't be a very hard subject to learn. The disadvantage is that this prior knowledge can be a problem. In order to learn sociology, we need to unlearn what we already know about society. In fact, the initial stage of learning sociology consists mainly of such unlearning. This is necessary because our prior knowledge about society, our common sense, is acquired from a particular viewpoint. This is the viewpoint of the social group and the social environment that we are socialized into. Our social context shapes our opinions, beliefs, and expectations about society and social relations. These beliefs are not necessarily wrong, though they can be. The problem is that they are partial. The word partial is being used here in two different senses: incomplete, the opposite of whole, and biased, the opposite of impartial. So our unlearned knowledge or common sense usually allows us to see only a part of social reality. Moreover, it is liable to be tilted towards the viewpoints and interests of our own social group. Sociology does not offer a solution to this problem in the form of a perspective that can show us the whole of reality in a completely unbiased way. Indeed, sociologists believe that such an ideal vantage point does not exist. We can only see by standing somewhere, and every somewhere offers only a partial view of the world. What sociology offers is to teach us how to see the world from many vantage points, not just our own, but also that of others unlike ourselves. Each vantage point provides only a partial view, but by comparing what the world looks like from the eyes of different kinds of people we get some sense of what the whole might look like, and what is hidden from view in each specific standpoint. What may be of even more interest to you is that sociology can show you what you look like to others. It can teach you how to look at yourself from the outside, so to speak. This is called self-reflexivity, or sometimes just reflexivity. This is the ability to reflect upon yourself, to turn back your gaze, which is usually directed outward, back towards yourself. But this self-inspection must be critical, i.e., it should be quick to criticize and slow to praise oneself. At the simplest level, you could say that understanding Indian society and its structure provides a sort of social map on which you could locate yourself. Like with a geographical map, locating oneself on a social map can be useful in the sense that you know where you are in relation to others in society. For example, suppose you live in the state of Arunachal Pradesh. If you look at a geographical map of India, you know that your state is in the northeastern corner of India. You also know that your state is small compared to many large states such as Uttar Pradesh, Madhya Pradesh, Maharashtra, or Rajasthan, but that it is larger than many others such as Manipur, Goa, Haryana, or Punjab. If you look at a physical features map, it could tell you what kind of terrain Arunachal has, hilly, forested, compared to other states and regions of India, and what natural resources it is rich in, and so on. A comparable social map would tell you where you are located in society. For example, as a 17 or 18-year-old, you belong to the social group called young people. People your age or younger account for about 40% of India's population. You might belong to a particular regional or linguistic community, such as a Gujarati speaker from Gujarat or a Telugu speaker from Andhra Pradesh. Depending on your parents' occupation and your family income, you would also be a member of an economic class, such as lower middle class or upper class. You could be a member of a particular religious community, a caste or tribe, or other such social group. Each of these identities would locate you on a social map, and among a web of social relationships. Sociology tells you about what kinds of groups or groupings there are in society, what their relationships are to each other, and what this might mean in terms of your own life. But sociology can do more than simply help to locate you or others in this simple sense of describing the places of different social groups. As C. Wright Mills, a well-known American sociologist, has written, sociology can help you to map the links and connections between personal troubles and social issues. By personal troubles, Mills means the kinds of individual worries, problems, or concerns that everyone has. So, for example, you may be unhappy about the way elders in your family treat you or how your brothers, sisters, or friends treat you. You may be worried about your future and what sort of job you might get. Other aspects of your individual identity may be sources of pride, tension, confidence, or embarrassment in different ways. But all of these are about one person and derive meaning from this personalized perspective. A social issue, on the other hand, is about large groups and not about the individuals who make them up. Thus, the generation gap or friction between older and younger generations is a social phenomenon, common to many societies and many time periods. Unemployment or the effects of a changing occupational structure is also a societal issue that concerns millions of different kinds of people. It includes, for example, the sudden increase in job prospects for information technology-related professions, as well as the declining demand for agricultural labor. Issues of communalism or the animosity of one religious community towards another, or casteism, which is the exclusion or oppression of some castes by others, are again society-wide problems. Different individuals may be implicated in them in different roles, depending on their social location. Thus, a person from a so-called upper caste who believes in the inferiority of the people born into so-called lower castes is involved in casteism as a perpetrator, while a member of a so-called low caste community is also involved, but as a victim. In the same way, both men and women, as distinct social groups, are affected by gender inequalities, but in very different ways. One version of such a map is already provided to us in childhood by the process of socialization, or the ways in which we are taught to make sense of the world around us. This is the common sense map. But as pointed out earlier, this kind of map can be misleading, and it can distort. Once we leave our common sense maps behind, there are no other ready-made maps available to us, because we have been socialized into only one, not several or all, social groups. If we want other kinds of maps, we must learn how to draw them. A sociological perspective teaches you how to draw social maps. 1.1 Introducing an Introduction. This entire book is meant to introduce you to Indian society from a sociological rather than common sense point of view. What can be said by way of an introduction to this introduction? Perhaps it would be appropriate at this point to indicate in advance the larger processes that were at work in shaping Indian society, processes that you will encounter in detail in the pages to follow. Broadly speaking, it was in the colonial period that a specifically Indian consciousness took shape. Colonial rule unified all of India for the first time, and brought in the forces of modernization and capitalist economic change. By and large, the changes brought about were irreversible. Society could never return to the way things were before. The economic, political, and administrative unification of India under colonial rule was achieved at great expense. Colonial exploitation and domination scarred Indian society in many ways. But paradoxically, colonialism also gave birth to its own enemy, nationalism. Historically, an Indian nationalism took shape under British colonialism. The shared experience of colonial domination helped unify and energize different sections of the community. The emerging middle classes began, with the aid of Western-style education, to challenge colonialism on its own ground. Ironically, colonialism and Western education also gave the impetus for the rediscovery of tradition. This led to the developments on the cultural and social front which solidified emergent forms of community at the national and regional levels. Colonialism created new classes and communities which came to play significant roles in subsequent history. The urban middle classes were the main carriers of nationalism and they led the campaign for freedom. Colonial interventions also crystallized religious and caste-based communities. These too became major players. The complex ways in which the subsequent history of contemporary Indian society evolved is something you will encounter in the following chapters. To a preview of this book. In this, the first of two textbooks on sociology, you will be introduced to the basic structure of Indian society. The second textbook will be focused on the specifics of social change and development in India. We begin with a discussion of the demographic structure of the Indian population, Chapter 2. As you know, India is currently the second most populous country in the world, and in a few decades is projected to overtake China and become the most populous country in the world. What are the ways in which sociologists and demographers study a population? Which aspects of the population are socially significant, and what has been happening on these fronts in the Indian case? Is our population simply an obstacle to development, or can it also be seen as helping development in some ways? These are some of the questions that this chapter tries to tackle. In Chapter 3, we revisit the basic building blocks of Indian society in the form of the institutions of caste, tribe, and family. As a unique feature of the Indian subcontinent, caste has always attracted a lot of scholarly attention. How has this institution been changing over the centuries, and what does caste really mean today? What is the context in which the concept of tribe was introduced into India? What sorts of communities are tribes supposed to be, and what is at stake in defining them as such? How do tribal communities define themselves in contemporary India? Finally, the family as an institution has also been subjected to tremendous pressure in these times of rapid and intense social change. What changes do we see in the diverse forms of the family that exist in India? By addressing questions like these, Chapter 3 builds the base for looking at further aspects of Indian society which would presuppose caste, tribe, and family. Chapter 4 explores the socio-cultural dimensions of the market as a powerful institution that has been the vehicle of change throughout world history. Given that the most sweeping and rapid economic changes were brought about first by colonialism and then by developmental policies, this chapter looks at how markets of different kinds have evolved in India, and the chain reactions they set in motion. Among the features of our society that have been the cause of greatest concern are its seemingly unlimited capacity for generating inequality and exclusion. Chapter 5 is devoted to this important subject. Chapter 5 looks at inequality and exclusion in the context of caste, tribe, gender, and the differently abled. Notorious as an instrument of division and injustice, the caste system has been the object of concerted attempts by the state and by the oppressed castes to reform or even abolish it. What are the concrete problems and issues that this attempt faced? How successful have movements to resist caste exclusion been in our recent past? What have been the special problems of tribal movements? In what context are tribal identities reasserting themselves today? Similar questions are dealt with in the context of gender relations, and the disabled or differently abled. To what extent is our society responsive to the needs of the differently abled? How much of an impact has the women's movement had on the social institutions that have oppressed women? Chapter 6 deals with the difficult challenges posed by the immense diversity of Indian society. This chapter invites us to step outside our normal, comfortable ways of thinking. The familiar clichés and slogans about India being a land of unity in diversity have a hard and complex side to them. Despite all the failures and inadequacies, India has not done too badly on this front. What have been our strengths and our weaknesses? How may young adults face issues like communal conflict, regional or linguistic chauvinism, and casteism without either wishing them away or being overwhelmed by them? Why is it important for our collective future as a nation that every minority in India not feel that it is insecure or at risk? Finally, in Chapter 7, some suggestions are provided for you and your teachers to think about the practical component of your course. This can be quite interesting and enjoyable, as you will discover. Chapter 2 The Demographic Structure of Indian Society. Demography is the systematic study of population. The term is of Greek origin and is composed of the two words, demos, people, and graphein, describe, implying the description of people. Demography studies the trends and processes associated with population, including changes in population size, patterns of births, deaths, and migration, and the structure and composition of the population, such as the relative proportions of women, men, and different age groups. There are different varieties of demography, including formal demography, which is a largely quantitative field, and social demography, which focuses on the social, economic, or political aspects of populations. All demographic studies are based on processes of counting or enumeration, such as the census or the survey, which involve the systematic collection of data on the people residing within a specified territory. Demography is a field that is of special importance to sociology. In fact, the emergence of sociology and its successful establishment as an academic discipline owed a lot to demography. Two different processes happened to take place at roughly the same time in Europe during the latter half of the 18th century: the formation of nation-states as the principal form of political organization, and the beginnings of the modern science of statistics. The modern state had begun to expand its role and functions. It had, for instance, begun to take an active interest in the development of early forms of public health management, policing and maintenance of law and order, economic policies relating to agriculture and industry, taxation and revenue generation, and the governance of cities. This new and constantly expanding sphere of state activity required the systematic and regular collection of social statistics or quantitative data on various aspects of the population and economy. The practice of the collection of social statistics by the state is in itself much older, but it acquired its modern form towards the end of the 18th century. The American census of 1790 was probably the first modern census, and the practice was soon taken up in Europe as well in the early 1800s. In India, censuses began to be conducted by the British Indian government between 186,772, and regular 10-yearly, or decennial, censuses have been conducted since 1881. Independent India continued the practice, and 6 decennial censuses have been conducted since 1951, the most recent being in 2001. The Indian census is the largest such exercise in the world, since China, which has a slightly larger population, does not conduct regular censuses. Demographic data are important for the planning and implementation of state policies, especially those for economic development and general public welfare. But when they first emerged, social statistics also provided a strong justification for the new discipline of sociology. Aggregate statistics, or the numerical characteristics that refer to a large collectivity consisting of millions of people, offer a concrete and strong argument for the existence of social phenomena. Even though country-level or state-level statistics like the number of deaths per 1,000 population or the death rate are made up by aggregating, or adding up, individual deaths, the death rate itself is a social phenomenon and must be explained at the social level. Émile Durkheim's famous study explaining the variation in suicide rates across different countries was a good example of this. Durkheim argued that the rate of suicide, i.e., number of suicides per 100,000 population, had to be explained by social causes, even though each particular instance of suicide may have involved reasons specific to that individual or her/his circumstances. Sometimes a distinction is made between formal demography and a broader field of population studies. Formal demography is primarily concerned with the measurement and analysis of the components of population change. Its focus is on quantitative analysis, for which it has a highly developed mathematical methodology suitable for forecasting population growth and changes in the composition of population. Population studies, or social demography, on the other hand, inquires into the wider causes and consequences of population structures and change. Social demographers believe that social processes and structures regulate demographic processes. Like sociologists, they seek to trace the social reasons that account for population trends. 2.1 Some theories and concepts in demography. The Malthusian theory of population growth, among the most famous theories of demography, is the one associated with the English political economist Thomas Robert Malthus, 1766 to 1834. Malthus' theory of population growth, outlined in his essay on population, 1798, was a rather pessimistic one. He argued that human populations tend to grow at a much faster rate than the rate at which the means of human subsistence, especially food, but also clothing and other agriculture-based products, can grow. Therefore, humanity is condemned to live in poverty forever, because the growth of agricultural production will always be overtaken by population growth. While population rises in geometric progression, i.e., like 2, 4, 8, 16, 32 etc., agricultural production can only grow in arithmetic progression, i.e., like 2, 4, 6, 8, 10 etc. Because population growth always outstrips growth in production of subsistence resources, the only way to increase prosperity is by controlling the growth of population. Unfortunately, humanity has only a limited ability to voluntarily reduce the growth of its population, through preventive checks such as postponing marriage or practicing sexual abstinence or celibacy. Malthus believed therefore that positive checks to population growth in the form of famines and diseases were inevitable, because they were nature's way of dealing with the imbalance between food supply and increasing population. Malthus' theory was influential for a long time. But it was also challenged by theorists who claimed that economic growth could outstrip population growth. However, the most effective refutation of his theory was provided by the historical experience of European countries. The pattern of population growth began to change in the latter half of 19th century, and by the end of the first quarter of the 20th century these changes were quite dramatic. Birth rates had declined, and outbreaks of epidemic diseases were being controlled. Malthus' predictions were proved false because both food production and standards of living continued to rise despite the rapid growth of population. Malthus was also criticized by liberal and Marxist scholars for asserting that poverty was caused by population growth. The critics argued that problems like poverty and starvation were caused by the unequal distribution of economic resources rather than by population growth. An unjust social system allowed a wealthy and privileged minority to live in luxury while the vast majority of the people were forced to live in poverty. The theory of demographic transition. Another significant theory in demography is the theory of demographic transition. This suggests that population growth is linked to overall levels of economic development and that every society follows a typical pattern of development-related population growth. There are three basic phases of population growth. The first stage is that of low population growth in a society that is underdeveloped and technologically backward. Growth rates are low because both the death rate and the birth rate are very high, so that the difference between the two, or the net growth rate, is low. The third, and last, stage is also one of low growth in a developed society where both death rate and birth rate have been reduced considerably and the difference between them is again small. Between these two stages is a transitional stage of movement from a backward to an advanced stage, and this stage is characterized by very high rates of growth of population. This population explosion happens because death rates are brought down relatively quickly through advanced methods of disease control, public health, and better nutrition. However, it takes longer for society to adjust to change and alter its reproductive behavior, which was evolved during the period of poverty and high death rates, to suit the new situation of relative prosperity and longer lifespans. This kind of transition was effected in Western Europe during the late 19th and early 20th century. More or less similar patterns are followed in the less developed countries that are struggling to reduce the birth rate in keeping with the falling mortality rate. In India too, the demographic transition is not yet complete as the mortality rate has been reduced but the birth rate has not been brought down to the same extent. Common concepts and indicators. Most demographic concepts are expressed as rates or ratios. They involve two numbers. One of these numbers is the particular statistic that has been calculated for a specific geographical administrative unit, the other number provides a standard for comparison. For example, the birth rate is the total number of live births in a particular area, an entire country, a state, a district, or other territorial unit, during a specified period, usually a year, divided by the total population of that area in thousands. In other words, the birth rate is the number of live births per 1,000 population. The death rate is a similar statistic, expressed as the number of deaths in a given area during a given time per 1,000 population. These statistics depend on the reporting of births and deaths by the families in which they occur. In fact, in most countries including India, people are required by law to report births and deaths to the appropriate authorities, the local police station or primary health center in the case of villages, and the relevant municipal office in the case of towns and cities. The rate of natural increase or the growth rate of population refers to the difference between the birth rate and the death rate. When this difference is zero, or, in practice, very small, then we say that the population has stabilized, or has reached the replacement level, which is the rate of growth required for new generations to replace the older ones that are dying out. Sometimes societies can experience a negative growth rate, that is, their fertility levels are below the replacement rate. This is true of many countries and regions in the world today, such as Japan, Russia, Italy, and Eastern Europe. On the other hand, some societies experience very high growth rates, particularly when they are going through the demographic transition described on the previous page. The fertility rate refers to the number of live births per 1,000 women in the childbearing age group, usually taken to be 15 to 49 years. But like the other rates discussed on the previous page, the birth and death rates, this is a crude rate. It is a rough average for an entire population and does not take account of the differences across age groups. Differences across age groups can sometimes be very significant in affecting the meaning of indicators. That is why demographers also calculate age-specific rates. The total fertility rate refers to the total number of live births that a hypothetical woman would have if she lived through the reproductive age group and had the average number of babies in each segment of this age group as determined by the age-specific fertility rates for that area. Another way of expressing this is that the total fertility rate is the average number of births to a cohort of women up to the end of the reproductive age period, estimated on the basis of the age-specific rates observed during a given period. The infant mortality rate is the number of deaths of babies before the age of 1 year per 1,000 live births. Likewise, the maternal mortality rate is the number of women who die in childbirth per 1,000 live births. High rates of infant and maternal mortality are an unambiguous indicator of backwardness and poverty. Development is accompanied by sharp falls in these rates as medical facilities and levels of education, awareness, and prosperity increase. One concept which is somewhat complicated is that of life expectancy. This refers to the estimated number of years that an average person is expected to survive. It is calculated on the basis of data on age-specific death rates in a given area over a period of time. The sex ratio refers to the number of females per 1,000 males in a given area at a specified time period. Historically, all over the world it has been found that there are slightly more females than males in most countries. This is despite the fact that slightly more male babies are born than female ones. Nature seems to produce roughly 943 to 952 female babies for every 1,000 males. If despite this fact the sex ratio is somewhat in favor of females, this seems to be due to two reasons. First, girl babies appear to have an advantage over boy babies in terms of resistance to disease in infancy. At the other end of the life cycle, women have tended to outlive men in most societies, so that there are more older women than men. The combination of these two factors leads to a sex ratio of roughly 1,050 females per 1,000 males in most contexts. However, it has been found that the sex ratio has been declining in some countries like China, South Korea, and especially India. This phenomenon has been linked to prevailing social norms that tend to value males much more than females, which leads to son preference and the relative neglect of girl babies. The age structure of the population refers to the proportion of persons in different age groups relative to the total population. The age structure changes in response to changes in levels of development and the average life expectancy. Initially, poor medical facilities, prevalence of disease and other factors make for a relatively short lifespan. Moreover, high infant and maternal mortality rates also have an impact on the age structure. With development, quality of life improves and with it the life expectancy also improves. This changes the age structure. Relatively smaller proportions of the population are found in the younger age groups and larger proportions in the older age groups. This is also referred to as the aging of the population. The dependency ratio is a measure comparing the portion of a population which is composed of dependents, i.e., elderly people who are too old to work, and children who are too young to work, with the portion that is in the working age group, generally defined as 15 to 64 years. The dependency ratio is equal to the population below 15 or above 64, divided by population in the 1564 age group. The ratio is usually expressed as a percentage. A rising dependency ratio is a cause for worry in countries that are facing an aging population. Since it becomes difficult for a relatively smaller proportion of working-age people to carry the burden of providing for a relatively larger proportion of dependents. On the other hand, a falling dependency ratio can be a source of economic growth and prosperity due to the larger proportion of workers relative to non-workers. This is sometimes referred to as the demographic dividend, or benefit flowing from the changing age structure. However, this benefit is temporary because the larger pool of working-age people will eventually turn into non-working old people. 2.2 Size and growth of India's population. India is the second most populous country in the world after China, with a total population of 103 crores, or 1.03 billion, according to the census of 2001. As can be seen from Table 1, the growth rate of India's population has not always been very high. Between 1901 and 1951 the average annual growth rate did not exceed 1.33%, a modest rate of growth. In fact, between 1911 and 1921 there was a negative rate of growth of 0.03%. This was because of the influenza epidemic during 1918-19 which killed about 12.5 million persons or 5% of the total population of the country, Visaria and Visaria 2003, 191. The growth rate of population substantially increased after independence from British rule, going up to 2.2% during 1961-1981. Since then, although the annual growth rate has decreased, it remains one of the highest in the developing world. Chart 1 shows the comparative movement of the crude birth and death rates. The impact of the demographic transition phase is clearly seen in the graph, where they begin to diverge from each other after the decade of 1921 to 1931. Before 1931, both death rates and birth rates are high, whereas, after this transitional moment, the death rates fall sharply but the birth rate only falls slightly. Table 1, the population of India and its growth during the 20th century. Year total population in millions. Average annual growth rate, %. Decadal growth rate, % 1901 238, 1911 252, 0.565.8, 1921 251, 0.03, 0.3, 1931 279, 1.04, 11.0, 1941 319, 1.33, 14.2, 1951 361, 1.25, 13.3, 1961 439, 1.96, 21.5, 1971 548, 2.22, 24.8, 1981 683, 2.20, 24.7, 1991 846, 2.14, 23.9, 2001 1028, 1.93, 21.3. The principal reasons for the decline in the death rate after 1921 were increased levels of control over famines and epidemic diseases. The latter cause was perhaps the most important. The major epidemic diseases in the past were fevers of various sorts, plague, smallpox and cholera. But the single biggest epidemic was the influenza epidemic of 191,819, which killed as many as 125 lakh people, or about 5% of the total population of India at that time. Estimates of deaths vary, and some are much higher. Also known as Spanish flu, the influenza pandemic was a global phenomenon. See the box below. A pandemic is an epidemic that affects a very wide geographical area. See the glossary. Improvements in medical cures for these diseases, programs for mass vaccination, and efforts to improve sanitation help to control epidemics. However, diseases like malaria, tuberculosis, and diarrhea and dysenteries continue to kill people even today, although the numbers are nowhere as high as they used to be in the epidemics of the past. Surat witnessed a small epidemic of plague in September 1994, while dengue and chikungunya epidemics have been reported in various parts of the country in 2006. Famines were also a major and recurring source of increased mortality. Famines were caused by high levels of continuing poverty and malnutrition in an agroclimatic environment that was very vulnerable to variations in rainfall. Lack of adequate means of transportation and communication, as well as inadequate efforts on the part of the state, were some of the factors responsible for famines. However, as scholars like Amartya Sen and others have shown, famines were not necessarily due to fall in food grains production, they were also caused by a failure of entitlements, or the inability of people to buy or otherwise obtain food. Substantial improvements in the productivity of Indian agriculture, especially through the expansion of irrigation, improved means of communication, and more vigorous relief and preventive measures by the state have all helped to drastically reduce deaths from famine. Nevertheless, starvation deaths are still reported from some backward regions of the country. The National Rural Employment Guarantee Act is the latest state initiative to tackle the problem of hunger and starvation in rural areas. Unlike the death rate, the birth rate has not registered a sharp fall. This is because the birth rate is a socio-cultural phenomenon that is relatively slow to change. By and large, increased levels of prosperity exert a strong downward pull on the birth rate. Once infant mortality rates decline, and there is an overall increase in levels of education and awareness, family size begins to fall. There are very wide variations in the fertility rates across the states of India, as can be seen in Chart 2. Some states like Kerala and Tamil Nadu have managed to bring down their total fertility rates, TFR, to 2.1 and 1.8 respectively. This means that the average woman in Tamil Nadu produces only 2.1 children, which is the replacement level, required to replace herself and her spouse. Kerala's TFR is actually below the replacement level, which means that the population is going to decline in the future. Many other states, like Himachal Pradesh, West Bengal, Karnataka, Maharashtra, have fairly low TFRs. But there are some states, notably Bihar, Madhya Pradesh, Rajasthan, and Uttar Pradesh, which still have very high TFRs of 4 or more. These few states already accounted for almost 45% of the total population as of 2001, and they will also account for about half, 50%, of the additions to the Indian population up to the year 2026. Uttar Pradesh alone is expected to account for a little less than 1/4, 22%, of this increase. Chart 3 shows the relative contribution to population growth from different regional groupings of states. 2.3 Age structure of the Indian population. India has a very young population, that is, the majority of Indians tend to be young, and the average age is also less than that for most other countries. Table 2 shows that the share of the under 15 age group in the total population has come down from its highest level of 42% in 1971 to 35% in 2001. The share of the 1,560 age group has increased slightly from 53% to 59%, while the share of the 60-plus age group is very small, but it has begun to increase, from 5% to 7%, over the same period. But the age composition of the Indian population is expected to change significantly in the next 2 decades. Most of this change will be at the two ends of the age spectrum, as Table 2 shows. The 0-14 age group will reduce its share by about 11%, from 34% in 2001 to 23% in 2026, while the 60-plus age group will increase its share by about 5%, from 7% in 2001 to about 12% in 2026. Chart 4 shows a graphical picture of the population pyramid from 1961 to its projected shape in 2016. As with fertility rates, there are wide regional variations in the age structure as well. While a state like Kerala is beginning to acquire an age structure like that of the developed countries, Uttar Pradesh presents a very different picture, with high proportions in the younger age groups and relatively low proportions among the aged. India as a whole is somewhere in the middle, because it includes states like Uttar Pradesh as well as states that are more like Kerala. Chart 5 shows the estimated population pyramids for Uttar Pradesh and Kerala in the year 2026. Note the difference in the location of the widest parts of the pyramid for Kerala and Uttar Pradesh. The bias towards younger age groups in the age structure is believed to be an advantage for India. Like the East Asian economies in the past decade and like Ireland today, India is supposed to be benefiting from a demographic dividend. This dividend arises from the fact that the current generation of working-age people is a relatively large one, and it has only a relatively small preceding generation of old people to support. But there is nothing automatic about this advantage. It needs to be consciously exploited through appropriate policies, as is explained in box 2.3 below. 2.4 The declining sex ratio in India. The sex ratio is an important indicator of gender balance in the population. As mentioned in the section on concepts earlier, historically, the sex ratio has been slightly in favor of females, that is, the number of females per 1,000 males has generally been somewhat higher than 1,000. However, India has had a declining sex ratio for more than a century, as is clear from Table 3. From 972 females per 1,000 males at the turn of the 20th century, the sex ratio has declined to 933 at the turn of the 21st century. The trends of the last 4 decades have been particularly worrying. From 941 in 1961, the sex ratio had fallen to an all-time low of 927 in 1991 before posting a modest increase in 2001. But what has really alarmed demographers, policymakers, social activists, and concerned citizens is the drastic fall in the child sex ratio. Age-specific sex ratios began to be computed in 1961. As is shown in Table 3, the sex ratio for the 0-6 years age group, known as the juvenile or child sex ratio, has generally been substantially higher than the overall sex ratio for all age groups, but it has been falling very sharply. In fact, the decade 1991-2001 represents an anomaly in that the overall sex ratio has posted its highest ever increase of 6 points from the all-time low of 927 to 933, but the child sex ratio has dropped from 945 to 927, a plunge of 18 points, taking it below the overall sex ratio for the first time. The state-level child sex ratios offer even greater cause for worry. As many as 6 states and union territories have a child sex ratio of under 900 females per 1,000 males. Punjab is the worst off with an incredibly low child sex ratio of 793, the only state below 800, followed by Haryana, Chandigarh, Delhi, Gujarat, and Himachal Pradesh. As Chart 6 shows, Uttaranchal, Rajasthan, Uttar Pradesh and Maharashtra are all under 925, while Madhya Pradesh, Goa, Jammu and Kashmir, Bihar, Tamil Nadu, Karnataka and Orissa are above the national average of 927 but below the 950 mark. Even Kerala, the state with the best overall sex ratio, does not do too well at 963, while the highest child sex ratio of 986 is found in Sikkim. Demographers and sociologists have offered several reasons for the decline in the sex ratio in India. The main health factor that affects women differently from men is childbearing. It is relevant to ask if the fall in the sex ratio may be partly due to the increased risk of death in childbirth that only women face. However, maternal mortality is supposed to decline with development, as levels of nutrition, general education, and awareness as well as the availability of medical and communication facilities improves. Indeed, maternal mortality rates have been coming down in India even though they remain high by international standards. So it is difficult to see how maternal mortality could have been responsible for the worsening of the sex ratio over time. Combined with the fact that the decline in the child sex ratios has been much steeper than the overall figure, social scientists believe that the cause has to be sought in the differential treatment of girl babies. Several factors may be held responsible for the decline in the child sex ratio, including severe neglect of girl babies in infancy, leading to higher death rates, sex-specific abortions that prevent girl babies from being born, and female infanticide, or the killing of girl babies due to religious or cultural beliefs. Each of these reasons point to a serious social problem, and there is some evidence that all of these have been at work in India. Practices of female infanticide have been known to exist in many regions, while increasing importance is being attached to modern medical techniques by which the sex of the baby can be determined in the very early stages of pregnancy. The availability of the sonogram, an X-ray-like diagnostic device based on ultrasound technology, originally developed to identify genetic or other disorders in the fetus, may be used to identify and selectively abort female fetuses. The regional pattern of low child sex ratios seems to support this argument. It is striking that the lowest child sex ratios are found in the most prosperous regions of India. Punjab, Haryana, Chandigarh, Delhi, Gujarat, and Maharashtra are among the richest states of India in terms of per capita incomes, and they are also the states with the lowest child sex ratios. So the problem of selective abortions is not due to poverty or ignorance or lack of resources. For example, if practices like dowry mean that parents have to make large dowry payments to marry off their daughters, then prosperous parents would be the ones most able to afford this. However, we find the sex ratio is lowest in the most prosperous regions. It is also possible, though this issue is still being researched, that as economically prosperous families decide to have fewer children, often only one or two now, they may also wish to choose the sex of their child. This becomes possible with the availability of ultrasound technology, although the government has passed strict laws banning this practice and imposing heavy fines and imprisonment as punishment. Known as the Prenatal Diagnostic Techniques, Regulation and Prevention of Misuse, Act, this law has been in force since 1996, and has been further strengthened in 2003. However, in the long run, the solution to problems like the bias against girl children depends more on how social attitudes evolve, even though laws and rules can also help. 2.5 Literacy. Literacy as a prerequisite to education is an instrument of empowerment. The more literate the population, the greater the consciousness of career options, as well as participation in the knowledge economy. Further, literacy can lead to health awareness and fuller participation in the cultural and economic well-being of the community. Literacy levels have improved considerably after independence, and almost 2/3 of our population is now literate. But improvements in the literacy rate have to struggle to keep up with the rate of growth of the Indian population, which is still quite high. Enormous effort is needed to ensure the literacy of the new generations, which are only just beginning to be smaller in numbers than in the past. Remember the discussion on age structure and the population pyramids earlier in this chapter. Literacy varies considerably across gender, across regions, and across social groups. As can be seen from Table 4, the literacy rate for women is almost 22% less than the literacy rate for men. However, female literacy has been rising faster than male literacy, partly because it started from relatively low levels. Thus, female literacy rose by almost 15% between 1991 and 2001 compared to the rise in male literacy of a little less than 12% in the same period. Literacy rates also vary by social group. Historically disadvantaged communities like the scheduled castes and scheduled tribes have lower rates of literacy, and rates of female literacy within these groups are even lower. Regional variations are still very wide, with states like Kerala approaching universal literacy, while states like Bihar are lagging far behind. The inequalities in the literacy rate are especially important because they tend to reproduce inequality across generations. Illiterate parents are at a severe disadvantage in ensuring that their children are well educated, thus perpetuating existing inequalities. 2.6 Rural-urban differences. The vast majority of the population of India has always lived in the rural areas, and that continues to be true. The 2001 census found that 72% of our population still lives in villages, while 28% is living in cities and towns. However, as Table 5 shows, the urban population has been increasing its share steadily, from about 11% at the beginning of the 20th century to about 28% at the beginning of the 21st century, an increase of about 2.5 times. It is not a question of numbers alone. Processes of modern development ensure that the economic and social significance of the agrarian rural way of life declines relative to the significance of the industrial urban way of life. This has been broadly true all over the world, and it is true in India as well. Agriculture used to be by far the largest contributor to the country's total economic production, but today it only contributes about 1/4 of the gross domestic product. While the majority of our people live in the rural areas and make their living out of agriculture, the relative economic value of what they produce has fallen drastically. Moreover, more and more people who live in villages may no longer work in agriculture or even in the village. Rural people are increasingly engaged in non-farm rural occupations like transport services, business enterprises, or craft manufacturing. If they are close enough, then they may travel daily to the nearest urban center to work while continuing to live in the village. Mass media and communication channels are now bringing images of urban lifestyles and patterns of consumption into the rural areas. Consequently, urban norms and standards are becoming well known even in the remote villages, creating new desires and aspirations for consumption. Mass transit and mass communication are bridging the gap between the rural and urban areas. Even in the past, the rural areas were never really beyond the reach of market forces, and today they are being more closely integrated into the consumer market. Considered from an urban point of view, the rapid growth in urbanization shows that the town or city has been acting as a magnet for the rural population. Those who cannot find work, or sufficient work, in the rural areas go to the city in search of work. This flow of rural to urban migration has also been accelerated by the continuous decline of common property resources like ponds, forests, and grazing lands. These common resources enabled poor people to survive in the villages although they owned little or no land. Now, these resources have been turned into private property, or they are exhausted. Ponds may run dry or no longer provide enough fish, forests may have been cut down and have vanished. If people no longer have access to these resources, but on the other hand have to buy many things in the market that they used to get free, like fuel, fodder, or supplementary food items, then their hardship increases. This hardship is worsened by the fact that opportunities for earning cash income are limited in the villages. Sometimes the city may also be preferred for social reasons, especially the relative anonymity it offers. The fact that urban life involves interaction with strangers can be an advantage for different reasons. For the socially oppressed groups like the scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, this may offer some partial protection from the daily humiliation they may suffer in the village where everyone knows their caste identity. The anonymity of the city also allows the poorer sections of the socially dominant rural groups to engage in low-status work that they would not be able to do in the village. All these reasons make the city an attractive destination for the villagers. The swelling cities bear testimony to this flow of population. This is evident from the rapid rate of urbanization in the post-independence period. While urbanization has been occurring at a rapid pace, it is the biggest cities, the metropolises, that have been growing the fastest. These metro attract migrants from the rural areas as well as from small towns. There are now 5,161 towns and cities in India, where 286 million people live. What is striking, however, is that more than two-thirds of the urban population lives in 27 big cities with million-plus populations. Clearly, the larger cities in India are growing at such a rapid rate that the urban infrastructure can hardly keep pace. With the mass media's primary focus on these cities, the public face of India is becoming more and more urban rather than rural. Yet in terms of the political power dynamics in the country, the rural areas remain a decisive force. 2.7 Population policy in India. It will be clear from the discussion in this chapter that population dynamics is an important matter and that it crucially affects the developmental prospects of a nation as well as the health and well-being of its people. This is particularly true of developing countries who have to face special challenges in this regard. It is hardly surprising therefore that India has had an official population policy for more than a half-century. In fact, India was perhaps the first country to explicitly announce such a policy in 1952. The population policy took the concrete form of the National Family Planning Program. The broad objectives of this program have remained the same: to try to influence the rate and pattern of population growth in socially desirable directions. In the early days, the most important objective was to slow down the rate of population growth through the promotion of various birth control methods, improve public health standards, and increase public awareness about population and health issues. Over the past half-century or so, India has many significant achievements to her credit in the field of population, as summarized in Box 2.4. The family planning program suffered a setback during the years of the national emergency, 1975–76. Normal parliamentary and legal procedures were suspended during this time and special laws and ordinances issued directly by the government, without being passed by Parliament, were in force. During this time the government tried to intensify the effort to bring down the growth rate of population by introducing a coercive program of mass sterilization. Here sterilization refers to medical procedures like vasectomy, for men, and tubectomy, for women, which prevent conception and childbirth. Vast numbers of mostly poor and powerless people were forcibly sterilized, and there was massive pressure on lower-level government officials, like school teachers or office workers, to bring people for sterilization in the camps that were organized for this purpose. There was widespread popular opposition to this program, and the new government elected after the emergency abandoned it. The National Family Planning Program was renamed as the National Family Welfare Program after the emergency, and coercive methods were no longer used. The program now has a broad-based set of socio-demographic objectives. A new set of guidelines were formulated as part of the National Population Policy of the year 2000. These are summarized in Box 2.5 in the form of the policy targets set for the year 2010. The history of India's National Family Welfare Program teaches us that while the state can do a lot to try and create the conditions for demographic change, most demographic variables, especially those related to human fertility, are ultimately matters of economic, social, and cultural change. Thomas Robert Malthus, 1766-01834, Malthus studied at Cambridge and trained to become a Christian priest. Later he was appointed Professor of History and Political Economy at the East India Company College at Haileybury near London, which was a training centre for the officers recruited to the Indian civil service. The power of population is so superior to the power of the earth to produce subsistence for man, that premature death must in some shape or other visit the human race. The vices of mankind are active and able ministers of depopulation. They are the precursors in the great army of destruction, and often finish the dreadful work themselves. But should they fail in this war of extermination, sickly seasons, epidemics, pestilence, and plague advance in terrific array, and sweep off their thousands and tens of thousands. Should success be still incomplete, gigantic inevitable famine stalks in the rear, and with one mighty blow levels the population with the food of the world. Thomas Robert Malthus, An Essay on the Principle of Population, 1798. The global influenza pandemic of 191,819 influenza is caused by a virus that attacks mainly the upper respiratory tract, the nose, throat, and bronchi, and rarely also the lungs. The genetic makeup of influenza viruses allows for both major and minor genetic changes, making them immune to existing vaccines. 3 times in the last century, the influenza viruses have undergone major genetic changes, resulting in global pandemics and large tolls in terms of both disease and deaths. The most infamous pandemic was Spanish flu, which affected large parts of the world population and is thought to have killed at least 40 million people in 1918-1919. More recently, 2 other influenza pandemics occurred in 1957, Asian influenza, and 1968, Hong Kong influenza, and caused significant morbidity and mortality globally. The global mortality rate from the 1918-1919 Spanish flu pandemic is not known, but is estimated at 2.55% of the human population, with 20% of the world population suffering from the disease to some extent. Influenza may have killed as many as 25 million in its first 25 weeks, in contrast, AIDS killed 25 million in its first 25 years. Influenza spread across the world, killing more than 25 million in 6 months. Some estimates put the total killed at over twice that number, possibly even 100 million. In the United States, about 28% of the population suffered, and 500,000 to 675,000 died. In Britain 200,000 died, in France more than 400,000. Entire villages perished in Alaska and southern Africa. In Australia an estimated 10,000 people died, and in the Fiji Islands, 14% of the population died during only 2 weeks, and in Western Samoa 22%. An estimated 17 million died in India, about 5% of India's population at the time. In the British Indian Army, almost 22% of troops who caught the disease died of it. While World War I did not cause the flu, the close quarters and mass movement of troops quickened its spread. It has been speculated that the soldiers' immune systems were weakened by the stresses of combat and chemical attacks, increasing their susceptibility to the disease. Does the changing age structure offer a demographic dividend for India? The demographic advantage or dividend to be derived from the age structure of the population is due to the fact that India is, and will remain for some time, one of the youngest countries in the world. A third of India's population was below 15 years of age in 2000. In 2020, the average Indian will be only 29 years old, compared with an average age of 37 in China and the United States, 45 in Western Europe, and 48 in Japan. This implies a large and growing labor force, which can deliver unexpected benefits in terms of growth and prosperity. The demographic dividend results from an increase in the proportion of workers relative to non-workers in the population. In terms of age, the working population is roughly that between 15 and 64 years of age. This working age group must support itself as well as those outside this age group, i.e., children and elderly people, who are unable to work and are therefore dependents. Changes in the age structure due to the demographic transition lower the dependency ratio, or the ratio of non-working age to working age population, thus creating the potential for generating growth. But this potential can be converted into actual growth only if the rise in the working age group is accompanied by increasing levels of education and employment. If the new entrants to the labor force are not educated, then their productivity remains low. If they remain unemployed, then they are unable to earn at all and become dependents rather than earners. Thus, changing age structure by itself cannot guarantee any benefits unless it is properly utilized through planned development. The real problem is in defining the dependency ratio as the ratio of the non-working age to working age population, rather than the ratio of non-workers to workers. The difference between the two is determined by the extent of unemployment and underemployment, which keep a part of the labor force out of productive work. This difference explains why some countries are able to exploit the demographic advantage while others are not. India is indeed facing a window of opportunity created by the demographic dividend. The effect of demographic trends on the dependency ratio defined in terms of age groups is quite visible. The total dependency ratio fell from 79 in 1970 to 64 in 2005. But the process is likely to extend well into this century, with the age-based dependency ratio projected to fall to 48 in 2025 because of continued fall in the proportion of children and then rise to 50 by 2050 because of an increase in the proportion of the aged. The problem, however, is employment. Data from the National Sample Survey Studies of 1999-2000 and from the 2001 Census of India reveal a sharp fall in the rate of employment generation, creation of new jobs, across both rural and urban areas. This is true for the young as well. The rate of growth of employment in the 1,530 age group, which stood at around 2.4% a year between 1987 and 1994 for both rural and urban men, fell to 0.7% for rural men and 0.3% for urban men during 1994 to 2004. This suggests that the advantage offered by a young labor force is not being exploited. Strategies exist to exploit the demographic window of opportunity that India has today. But India's recent experience suggests that market forces by themselves do not ensure that such strategies would be implemented. Unless a way forward is found, we may miss out on the potential benefits that the country's changing age structure temporarily offers. India's demographic achievement. Half a century after formulating the National Family Welfare Programme, India has reduced crude birth rate from 40.8, 1951, to 24.1, 2004, SRS, reduced the infant mortality rate from 146 per 1,000 live births, 1951, to 58 per 1,000 live births, 2004, SRS, quadrupled the couple protection rate from 10.4%, 1971, to 44%, 1999, reduced crude death rate from 25, 1951, to 7.5, 2004, SRS, added 25 years to life expectancy from 37 years to 62 years. Achieved nearly universal awareness of the need for and methods of family planning, and halved the total fertility rate from 6.0, 1951, to 3.0, 2004, SRS. National Socio-Demographic Goals for 2010 P address the unmet needs for basic reproductive and child health services, supplies, and infrastructure. P make school education up to age 14 free and compulsory, and reduce dropouts at primary and secondary school levels to below 20% for both boys and girls. Reduce infant mortality rate to below 30 per 1,000 live births. Reduce maternal mortality ratio to below 100 per 100,000 live births. P. Achieve universal immunization of children against all vaccine-preventable diseases. P. Promote delayed marriage for girls, not earlier than age 18 and preferably after 20 years of age. P. Achieve 80% institutional deliveries and 100% deliveries by trained persons. P. Achieve universal access to information/counseling, and services for fertility regulation and contraception with a wide basket of choices. P. Achieve 100% registration of births, deaths, marriage, and pregnancy. P. Contain the spread of acquired immunodeficiency syndrome, AIDS, and promote greater integration between the management of reproductive tract infections, RTI, and sexually transmitted infections, STI, and the National AIDS Control Organization. Prevent and control communicable diseases. P. Integrate Indian systems of medicine, ISM, in the provision of reproductive and child health services, and in reaching out to households. P. Promote vigorously the small family norm to achieve replacement levels of TFR. Bring about convergence in implementation of related social sector programs so that family welfare becomes a people-centered program. Chapter 3 Social Institutions, Continuity and Change. Having studied the structure and dynamics of the population of India in Chapter 2, we turn now to the study of social institutions. A population is not just a collection of separate, unrelated individuals. It is a society made up of distinct but interlinked classes and communities of various kinds. These communities are sustained and regulated by social institutions and social relationships. In this chapter we will be looking at three institutions that are central to Indian society, namely caste, tribe, and family. 3.1 Caste and the caste system. Like any Indian, you already know that caste is the name of an ancient social institution that has been part of Indian history and culture for thousands of years. But like any Indian living in the 21st century, you also know that something called caste is definitely a part of Indian society today. To what extent are these two castes, the one that is supposed to be part of India's past, and the one that is part of its present, the same thing? This is the question that we will try to answer in this section. Caste in the past. Caste is an institution uniquely associated with the Indian subcontinent. While social arrangements producing similar effects have existed in other parts of the world, the exact form has not been found elsewhere. Although it is an institution characteristic of Hindu society, caste has spread to the major non-Hindu communities of the Indian subcontinent. This is especially true of Muslims, Christians, and Sikhs. As is well known, the English word caste is actually a borrowing from the Portuguese casta, meaning pure breed. The word refers to a broad institutional arrangement that in Indian languages, beginning with the ancient Sanskrit, is referred to by two distinct terms, Varna and Jati. Varna, literally color, is the name given to a fourfold division of society into Brahmana, Kshatriya, Vaishya, and Shudra, though this excludes a significant section of the population composed of the outcasts, foreigners, slaves, conquered peoples, and others, sometimes referred to as the Panchamas or fifth category. Jati is a generic term referring to species or kinds of anything, ranging from inanimate objects to plants, animals and human beings. Jati is the word most commonly used to refer to the institution of caste in Indian languages, though it is interesting to note that, increasingly, Indian language speakers are beginning to use the English word caste. The precise relationship between Varna and Jati has been the subject of much speculation and debate among scholars. The most common interpretation is to treat Varna as a broad all-India aggregative classification, while Jati is taken to be a regional or local sub-classification involving a much more complex system consisting of hundreds or even thousands of castes and subcastes. This means that while the four Varna classification is common to all of India, the Jati hierarchy has more local classifications that vary from region to region. Opinions also differ on the exact age of the caste system. It is generally agreed, though, that the four Varna classification is roughly 3,000 years old. However, the caste system stood for different things in different time periods, so that it is misleading to think of the same system continuing for 3,000 years. In its earliest phase, in the late Vedic period roughly between 900–500 BC, the caste system was really a Varna system and consisted of only four major divisions. These divisions were not very elaborate or very rigid, and they were not determined by birth. Movement across the categories seems to have been not only possible but quite common. It is only in the post-Vedic period that caste became the rigid institution that is familiar to us from well-known definitions. The most commonly cited defining features of caste are the following. 1. Caste is determined by birth. A child is born into the caste of its parents. Caste is never a matter of choice. One can never change one's caste, leave it, or choose not to join it, although there are instances where a person may be expelled from their caste. 2. Membership in a caste involves strict rules about marriage. Caste groups are endogamous, i.e., marriage is restricted to members of the group. Caste membership also involves rules about food and food sharing. What kinds of food may or may not be eaten is prescribed, and who one may share food with is also specified. Caste involves a system consisting of many castes arranged in a hierarchy of rank and status. In theory, every person has a caste, and every caste has a specified place in the hierarchy of all castes. While the hierarchical position of many castes, particularly in the middle ranks, may vary from region to region, there is always a hierarchy. Castes also involve subdivisions within themselves, i.e., castes almost always have subcastes, and sometimes subcastes may also have sub-subcastes. This is referred to as a segmental organization. Castes were traditionally linked to occupations. A person born into a caste could only practice the occupation associated with that caste, so that occupations were hereditary, i.e., passed on from generation to generation. On the other hand, a particular occupation could only be pursued by the caste associated with it. Members of other castes could not enter the occupation. These features are the prescribed rules found in ancient scriptural texts. Since these prescriptions were not always practiced, we cannot say to what extent these rules actually determined the empirical reality of caste, its concrete meaning for the people living at that time. As you can see, most of the prescriptions involved prohibitions or restrictions of various sorts. It is also clear from the historical evidence that caste was a very unequal institution. Some castes benefited greatly from the system, while others were condemned to a life of endless labor and subordination. Most important, once caste became rigidly determined by birth, it was in principle impossible for a person to ever change their life circumstances. Whether they deserved it or not, an upper caste person would always have high status, while a lower caste person would always be of low status. Theoretically, the caste system can be understood as the combination of two sets of principles, one based on difference and separation and the other on holism and hierarchy. Each caste is supposed to be different from and is therefore strictly separated from every other caste. Many of the scriptural rules of caste are thus designed to prevent the mixing of castes, rules ranging from marriage, food sharing, and social interaction to occupation. On the other hand, these different and separated castes do not have an individual existence. They can only exist in relation to a larger whole, the totality of society consisting of all castes. Further, this societal whole or system is a hierarchical rather than egalitarian system. Each individual caste occupies not just a distinct place, but also an ordered rank, a particular position in a ladder-like arrangement going from highest to lowest. The hierarchical ordering of castes is based on the distinction between purity and pollution. This is a division between something believed to be closer to the sacred, thus connoting ritual purity, and something believed to be distant from or opposed to the sacred, therefore considered ritually polluting. Castes that are considered ritually pure have high status, while those considered less pure or impure have low status. As in all societies, material power, i.e., economic or military power, is closely associated with social status, so that those in power tend to be of high status, and vice versa. Historians believe that those who were defeated in wars were often assigned low caste status. Finally, castes are not only unequal to each other in ritual terms, they are also supposed to be complementary and non-competing groups. In other words, each caste has its own place in the system which cannot be taken by any other caste. Since caste is also linked with occupation, the system functions as the social division of labor, except that, in principle, it allows no mobility. Not surprisingly, our sources of knowledge about the past and especially the ancient past are inadequate. It is difficult to be very certain about what things were like at that time, or the reasons why some institutions and practices came to be established. But even if we knew all this, it still cannot tell us about what should be done today. Just because something happened in the past or is part of our tradition, it is not necessarily right or wrong forever. Every age has to think afresh about such questions and come to its own collective decision about its social institutions. Colonialism and caste. Compared to the ancient past, we know a lot more about caste in our recent history. If modern history is taken to begin with the 19th century, then Indian independence in 1947 offers a natural dividing line between the colonial period, roughly 150 years from around 1800 to 1947, and the post-independence or post-colonial period, the 6 decades from 1947 to the present day. The present form of caste as a social institution has been shaped very strongly by both the colonial period as well as the rapid changes that have come about in independent India. Scholars have agreed that all major social institutions and especially the institution of caste underwent major changes during the colonial period. In fact, some scholars argue that what we know today as caste is more a product of colonialism than of ancient Indian tradition. Not all of the changes brought about were intended or deliberate. Initially, the British administrators began by trying to understand the complexities of caste in an effort to learn how to govern the country efficiently. Some of these efforts took the shape of very methodical and intensive surveys and reports on the customs and manners of various tribes and castes all over the country. Many British administrative officials were also amateur ethnologists and took great interest in pursuing such surveys and studies. But by far the most important official effort to collect information on caste was through the census. First begun in the 1860s, the census became a regular 10-yearly exercise conducted by the British Indian government from 1881 onwards. The 1901 census under the direction of Herbert Risley was particularly important as it sought to collect information on the social hierarchy of caste, i.e., the social order of precedence in particular regions, as to the position of each caste in the rank order. This effort had a huge impact on social perceptions of caste, and hundreds of petitions were addressed to the Census Commissioner by representatives of different castes claiming a higher position in the social scale and offering historical and scriptural evidence for their claims. Overall, scholars feel that this kind of direct attempt to count caste and to officially record caste status changed the institution itself. Before this kind of intervention, caste identities had been much more fluid and less rigid. Once they began to be counted and recorded, caste began to take on a new life. Other interventions by the colonial state also had an impact on the institution. The land revenue settlements and related arrangements and laws served to give legal recognition to the customary, caste-based, rights of the upper castes. These castes now became landowners in the modern sense rather than feudal classes with claims on the produce of the land, or claims to revenue or tribute of various kinds. Large-scale irrigation schemes like the ones in the Punjab were accompanied by efforts to settle populations there, and these also had a caste dimension. At the other end of the scale, towards the end of the colonial period, the administration also took an interest in the welfare of downtrodden castes, referred to as the depressed classes at that time. It was as part of these efforts that the Government of India Act of 1935 was passed, which gave legal recognition to the lists or schedules of castes and tribes marked out for special treatment by the state. This is how the terms scheduled tribes and thus scheduled castes came into being. Castes at the bottom of the hierarchy that suffered severe discrimination, including all the so-called untouchable castes, were included among the scheduled castes. You will read more on untouchability and the struggles against it in Chapter 5 on social exclusion. Thus colonialism brought about major changes in the institution of caste. Perhaps it would be more accurate to say that the institution of caste underwent fundamental changes during the colonial period. Not just India, but the whole world was undergoing rapid change during this period due to the spread of capitalism and modernity. Caste in the present Indian independence in 1947 marked a big, but ultimately only partial break with the colonial past. Caste considerations had inevitably played a role in the mass mobilizations of the nationalist movement. Efforts to organize the depressed classes and particularly the untouchable castes predated the nationalist movement, having begun in the second half of the 19th century. This was an initiative taken from both ends of the caste spectrum by upper caste progressive reformers as well as by members of the lower castes such as Mahatma Jyotiba Phule and Babasaheb Ambedkar in western India, Ian Kalai, Sri Narayana Guru, Eathidas and Periyar, E. V. Ramaswamy Nayakar, in the south. Both Mahatma Gandhi and Babasaheb Ambedkar began organizing protests against untouchability from the 1920s onwards. Anti-untouchability programs became a significant part of the Congress agendas so that, by the time independence was on the horizon, there was a broad agreement across the spectrum of the nationalist movement to abolish caste distinctions. The dominant view in the nationalist movement was to treat caste as a social evil and as a colonial ploy to divide Indians. But the nationalist leaders, above all, Mahatma Gandhi, were able to simultaneously work for the upliftment of the lowest castes, advocate the abolition of untouchability and other caste restrictions, and, at the same time, reassure the landowning upper castes that their interests, too, would be looked after. The post-independence Indian state inherited and reflected these contradictions. On the one hand, the state was committed to the abolition of caste and explicitly wrote this into the constitution. On the other hand, the state was both unable and unwilling to push through radical reforms which would have undermined the economic basis for caste inequality. At yet another level, the state assumed that if it operated in a caste-blind manner, this would automatically lead to the undermining of caste-based privileges and the eventual abolition of the institution. For example, appointments to government jobs took no account of caste, thus leaving the well-educated upper castes and the ill-educated or often illiterate lower castes to compete on equal terms. The only exception to this was in the form of reservations for the scheduled castes and scheduled tribes. In other words, in the decades immediately after independence, the state did not make sufficient effort to deal with the fact that the upper castes and the lower castes were far from equal in economic and educational terms. The development activity of the state and the growth of private industry also affected caste indirectly through the speeding up and intensification of economic change. Modern industry created all kinds of new jobs for which there were no caste rules. Urbanization and the conditions of collective living in the cities made it difficult for the caste-segregated patterns of social interaction to survive. At a different level, modern educated Indians attracted to the liberal ideas of individualism and meritocracy, began to abandon the more extreme caste practices. On the other hand, it was remarkable how resilient caste proved to be. Recruitment to industrial jobs, whether in the textile mills of Mumbai, then Bombay, the jute mills of Kolkata, then Calcutta, or elsewhere, continued to be organized along caste and kinship-based lines. The middlemen who recruited labor for factories tended to recruit them from their own caste and regions so that particular departments or shop floors were often dominated by specific castes. Prejudice against the untouchables remained quite strong and was not absent from the city, though not as extreme as it could be in the village. Not surprisingly, it was in the cultural and domestic spheres that caste has proved strongest. Endogamy, or the practice of marrying within the caste, remained largely unaffected by modernization and change. Even today, most marriages take place within caste boundaries, although there are more inter-caste marriages. While some boundaries may have become more flexible or porous, the borders between groups of castes of similar socio-economic status are still heavily patrolled. For example, inter-caste marriages within the upper castes, e.g., Brahmin, Bania, Rajput, may be more likely now than before, but marriages between an upper caste and backward or scheduled caste person remain rare even today. Something similar may have occurred with regard to rules of food sharing. Perhaps, the most eventful and important sphere of change has been that of politics. From its very beginnings in independent India, democratic politics has been deeply conditioned by caste. While its functioning has become more and more complex and hard to predict, it cannot be denied that caste remains central to electoral politics. Since the 1980s we have also seen the emergence of explicitly caste-based political parties. In the early general elections, it seemed as though caste solidarities were decisive in winning elections. But the situation soon got very complicated as parties competed with each other in utilizing the same kind of caste calculus. Sociologists and social anthropologists coined many new concepts to try and understand these processes of change. Perhaps the most common of these are Sanskritization and dominant caste, both contributed by M.N. Srinivas, but discussed extensively and criticized by other scholars. Sanskritization refers to a process whereby members of a usually middle or lower, caste attempt to raise their own social status by adopting the ritual, domestic and social practices of a caste, or castes, of higher status. Although this phenomenon is an old one and predates independence and perhaps even the colonial period, it has intensified in recent times. The patterns for emulation chosen most often were the Brahmin or Kshatriya castes. Practices included adopting vegetarianism, wearing of sacred thread, performance of specific prayers and religious ceremonies, and so on. Sanskritization usually accompanies or follows a rise in the economic status of the caste attempting it, though it may also occur independently. Subsequent research has led to many modifications and revisions being suggested for this concept. These include the argument that Sanskritization may be a defiant claiming of previously prohibited ritual/social privileges, such as the wearing of the sacred thread, which used to invite severe punishment, rather than a flattering imitation of the upper castes by the lower castes. Dominant caste is a term used to refer to those castes which had a large population and were granted land rights by the partial land reforms effected after independence. The land reforms took away rights from the erstwhile claimants, the upper castes who were absentee landlords in the sense that they played no part in the agricultural economy other than claiming their rent. They frequently did not live in the village either, but were based in towns and cities. These land rights now came to be vested in the next layer of claimants, those who were involved in the management of agriculture but were not themselves the cultivators. These intermediate castes in turn depended on the labor of the lower castes, including specially the untouchable castes for tilling and tending the land. However, once they got land rights, they acquired considerable economic power. Their large numbers also gave them political power in the era of electoral democracy based on universal adult franchise. Thus, these intermediate castes became the dominant castes in the countryside and played a decisive role in regional politics and the agrarian economy. Examples of such dominant castes include the Yadavs of Bihar and Uttar Pradesh, the Phakaligas of Karnataka, the Reddys and Kamas of Andhra Pradesh, the Marathas of Maharashtra, the Jats of Punjab, Haryana and western Uttar Pradesh, and the Patidas of Gujarat. One of the most significant yet paradoxical changes in the caste system in the contemporary period is that it has tended to become invisible for the upper caste, urban middle and upper classes. For these groups, who have benefited the most from the developmental policies of the post-colonial era, caste has appeared to decline in significance precisely because it has done its job so well. Their caste status had been crucial in ensuring that these groups had the necessary economic and educational resources to take full advantage of the opportunities offered by rapid development. In particular, the upper caste elite were able to benefit from subsidized public education, especially professional education in science, technology, medicine, and management. At the same time, they were also able to take advantage of the expansion of state sector jobs in the early decades after independence. In this initial period, their lead over the rest of society, in terms of education, ensured that they did not face any serious competition. As their privileged status got consolidated in the second and third generations, these groups began to believe that their advancement had little to do with caste. Certainly for the third generations from these groups, their economic and educational capital alone is quite sufficient to ensure that they will continue to get the best in terms of life chances. For this group, it now seems that caste plays no part in their public lives, being limited to the personal sphere of religious practice or marriage and kinship. However, a further complication is introduced by the fact that this is a differentiated group. Although the privileged as a group are overwhelmingly upper caste, not all upper caste people are privileged, some being poor. For the so-called scheduled castes and tribes and the backward castes, the opposite has happened. For them, caste has become all too visible, indeed their caste has tended to eclipse the other dimensions of their identities. Because they have no inherited educational and social capital, and because they must compete with an already entrenched upper caste group, they cannot afford to abandon their caste identity, for it is one of the few collective assets they have. Moreover, they continue to suffer from discrimination of various kinds. The policies of reservation and other forms of protective discrimination instituted by the state in response to political pressure serve as their lifelines. But using this lifeline tends to make their caste the all-important and often the only aspect of their identity that the world recognizes. The juxtaposition of these two groups, a seemingly casteless upper caste group and an apparently caste-defined lower caste group, is one of the central aspects of the institution of caste in the present. 3.2 Tribal communities. Tribe is a modern term for communities that are very old, being among the oldest inhabitants of the subcontinent. Tribes in India have generally been defined in terms of what they were not. Tribes were communities that did not practice a religion with a written text, did not have a state or political form of the normal kind, did not have sharp class divisions, and, most important, they did not have caste and were neither Hindus nor peasants. The term was introduced in the colonial era. The use of a single term for a very disparate set of communities was more a matter of administrative convenience. Classifications of tribal societies. In terms of positive characteristics, tribes have been classified according to their permanent and acquired traits. Permanent traits include region, language, physical characteristics, and ecological habitat. Permanent traits. The tribal population of India is widely dispersed, but there are also concentrations in certain regions. About 85% of the tribal population lives in Middle India, a wide band stretching from Gujarat and Rajasthan in the west to West Bengal and Orissa in the east, with Madhya Pradesh, Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh, and parts of Maharashtra and Andhra Pradesh forming the heart of this region. Of the remaining 15%, over 11% is in the northeastern states, leaving only a little over 3% living in the rest of India. If we look at the share of tribals in the state population, then the northeastern states have the highest concentrations, with all states except Assam having concentrations of more than 30%, and some like Arunachal Pradesh, Meghalaya, Mizoram, and Nagaland with more than 60% and up to 95% of tribal population. In the rest of the country, however, the tribal population is very small, being less than 12% in all states except Orissa and Madhya Pradesh. The ecological habitats covered include hills, forests, rural plains, and urban industrial areas. In terms of language, tribes are categorized into 4 categories. 2 of them, Indo-Aryan and Dravidian, are shared by the rest of the Indian population as well, and tribes account for only about 1% of the former and about 3% of the latter. The other 2 language groups, the Austric and Tibeto-Burman, are primarily spoken by tribals, who account for all of the first and over 80% of the second group. In physical racial terms, tribes are classified under the Negrito, Australoid, Mongoloid, Dravidian and Aryan categories. The last 2 are again shared with the rest of the population of India. In terms of size, tribes vary a great deal, ranging from about 7 million to some Andamanese Icelanders who may number less than 100 persons. The biggest tribes are the Gonds, Bhils, Santals, Orans, Minas, Bodos, and Mundas, all of whom are at least 1 million strong. The total population of tribes amounts to about 8.2% of the population of India, or about 84 million persons according to the 2001 census. Acquired characteristics. Classifications based on acquired traits use 2 main criteria: mode of livelihood, and extent of incorporation into Hindu society, or a combination of the 2. On the basis of livelihood, tribes can be categorized into fishermen, food gatherers and hunters, shifting cultivators, peasants and plantation and industrial workers. However, the dominant classification both in academic sociology as well as in politics and public affairs is the degree of assimilation into Hindu society. Assimilation can be seen either from the point of view of the tribes, or, as has been most often the case, from the point of view of the dominant Hindu mainstream. From the tribe's point of view, apart from the extent of assimilation, attitude towards Hindu society is also a major criterion, with differentiation between tribes that are positively inclined towards Hinduism and those who resist or oppose it. From the mainstream point of view, tribes may be viewed in terms of the status accorded to them in Hindu society, ranging from the high status given to some, to the generally low status accorded to most. Tribe, the career of a concept. During the 1960s, scholars debated whether tribes should be seen as one end of a continuum with caste-based, Hindu, peasant society, or whether they were an altogether different kind of community. Those who argued for the continuum saw tribes as not being fundamentally different from caste peasant society, but merely less stratified, fewer levels of hierarchy, and with a more community-based rather than individual notion of resource ownership. However, opponents argued that tribes were wholly different from castes because they had no notion of purity and pollution, which is central to the caste system. In short, the argument for a tribe-caste distinction was founded on an assumed cultural difference between Hindu castes, with their beliefs in purity and pollution and hierarchical integration, and animist tribals with their more egalitarian and kinship-based modes of social organization. By the 1970s, all the major definitions of tribe were shown to be faulty. It was pointed out that the tribe-peasantry distinction did not hold in terms of any of the commonly advanced criteria: size, isolation, religion, and means of livelihood. Some Indian tribes like Santhal, Gonds, and Bhils are very large and spread over extensive territory. Certain tribes like Munda, Hos, and others have long since turned to settled agriculture, and even hunting-gathering tribes, like the Burhors of Bihar, employ specialized households to make baskets, press oil, etc. It has also been pointed out in a number of cases, that in the absence of other alternatives, castes, or non-tribals, have turned to hunting and gathering. The discussion on caste-tribe differences was accompanied by a large body of literature on the mechanisms through which tribes were absorbed into Hindu society, throughout the ages through Sanskritization, acceptance into the Shudra fold following conquest by caste Hindus, through acculturation, and so on. The whole span of Indian history is often seen as an absorption of different tribal groups into caste Hindu society at varying levels of the hierarchy, as their lands were colonized and the forests cut down. This is seen as either natural, parallel to the process by which all groups are assimilated into Hinduism as sects, or it is seen as exploitative. The early school of anthropologists tended to emphasize the cultural aspects of tribal absorption into the mainstream, while the later writers have concentrated on the exploitative and political nature of the incorporation. Some scholars have also argued that there is no coherent basis for treating tribes as pristine, i.e., original or pure societies uncontaminated by civilization. They propose instead that tribes should really be seen as secondary phenomena arising out of the exploitative and colonialist contact between pre-existing states and non-state groups like the tribals. This contact itself creates an ideology of tribalism. The tribal groups begin to define themselves as tribals in order to distinguish themselves from the newly encountered others. Nevertheless, the idea that tribes are like Stone Age hunting and gathering societies that have remained untouched by time is still common, even though this has not been true for a long time. To begin with, Adivasis were not always the oppressed groups they are now. There were several Gond kingdoms in central India, such as that of Garha Mandla, or Chanda. Many of the so-called Rajput kingdoms of central and western India actually emerged through a process of stratification among Adivasi communities themselves. Adivasis often exercised dominance over the plains people through their capacity to raid them, and through their services as local militias. They also occupied a special trade niche, trading forest produce, salt and elephants. Moreover, the capitalist economy's drive to exploit forest resources and minerals and to recruit cheap labor has brought tribal societies in contact with mainstream society a long time ago. Mainstream attitudes towards tribes. Although the early anthropological work of the colonial era had described tribes as isolated cohesive communities, colonialism had already brought irrevocable changes in their world. On the political and economic front, tribal societies were faced with the incursion of money lenders. They were also losing their land to non-tribal immigrant settlers, and their access to forests because of the government policy of reservation of forests and the introduction of mining operations. Unlike other areas, where land rent was the primary source of surplus extraction, in these hilly and forested areas, it was mostly appropriation of natural resources, forests and minerals, which was the main source of income for the colonial government. Following the various rebellions in tribal areas in the 18th and 19th centuries, the colonial government set up excluded and partially excluded areas, where the entry of non-tribals was prohibited or regulated. In these areas, the British favoured indirect rule through local kings or headmen. The famous isolation versus integration debate of the 1940s built upon this standard picture of tribal societies as isolated wholes. The isolationist side argued that tribals needed protection from traders, moneylenders, and Hindu and Christian missionaries, all of whom were intent on reducing tribals to detribalist landless labor. The integrationists, on the other hand, argued that tribals were merely backward Hindus, and their problems had to be addressed within the same framework as that of other backward classes. This opposition dominated the Constituent Assembly debates, which were finally settled along the lines of a compromise which advocated welfare schemes that would enable controlled integration. The subsequent schemes for tribal development 5-year plans